Miatta, do you agree that we've moved in the direction of state intervention, and do you think that it's something that we should maintain?
We have definitely shifted. And my view is, it's never just, either state or markets. There's always a balance. But where state intervention makes sense is where there are problems that a collective response is better than an individualized response. And I think the thing that the pandemic has unearthed and has shone a spotlight to is not just, the pandemic itself, which you cannot solve through individualized responses. It absolutely needs a collective response, and the state is a mechanism by which you provide that. But it's also shone a huge spotlight on deep-seated structural problems in our economy. So whether it's the inequality that exists between people and places, whether it's how denuded some of our social safety nets and protections have become that have left people hugely vulnerable in this pandemic, or whether it's about the risk of not preparing for these big seismic shocks to our economy and our ways of life. And I think all of those require collective responses. So what we're seeing as a response to both the pandemic, but I think coming out of the pandemic, when we start thinking about the recovery, will be governments intervening as a form of kind of collective action in order to try and solve these problems. And that must be right, because they are bigger than any one individual can solve.
But taking some of the questions you've mentioned, safety nets and inequality, the safety nets are a bit thinner and more fragile now because the economy is smaller, and inequality seems to be growing. So doesn't that suggest to us that we need to grow the economy? And are you saying that you can grow the economy through state intervention, or doesn't it really have to be the private sector?
So it absolutely will have to be the private sector. But when the private sector is being completely hammered by conditions outside of their control. So, the government, for public health reasons, rightly so, had to freeze the economy. And that has hugely impacted on businesses in different sectors. As we rethaw the economy, as we try and build back from this, it is right and absolutely imperative that government intervenes to support businesses through this. But I think the bigger point for me is, any one of those issues will require governments to intervene to support. So if we're thinking about the social safety net, if we're thinking about inequality, simply growing the economy is not enough. And, if you needed any lesson of that, the last 10 years is a lesson. So what we saw coming out of the last financial crisis is, yes, we did grow the economy, but living standards did not shift. And that is quite unprecedented in our history, where growth does not translate into the majority of people being better off. The big lesson from that, and I really hope we all learn that lesson, is just the remedy that says you grow and that's enough is not enough. The economy only matters insofar as it makes our lives better. And if it's not, there is something that is wrong with that model, and it will require collective action, and the state is one mechanism in which you do it, to ensure what growth is created benefits everyone coming out of this.
But on the other hand, Miatta, since 1945, we've had a fairly important element of redistribution in our society. The welfare state has grown. It's become very big indeed. It's worth hundreds of billions of pounds every year. So really, if redistribution were the answer, wouldn't we have achieved equality by now, or at least less inequality?
Really good question. I think my answer to it is it's redistribution is a mechanism by which we put a plaster over the problem. So the problem is the fact that, for a very long time, we've had an economy that benefits people disproportionately differently. And you're never going to get complete inequality. You're never going to get an economic model in which everyone benefits the same. But the huge disparities that we've seen for decades now, I think is hugely problematic. And so we've created redistributive mechanisms that try to plug that, but we've never tried to go to the root cause. We've never tried to say, well, actually, how do we re-gear the economy? So it's not just about growth that benefits a small minority or, and at points in our history, a bigger minority, but it's about growth that benefits everyone. It's about growth that drives well-being and living standards. And if we start there, then actually the sets of policy interventions we would design would be different. And so, yes, redistribution has helped. And I think things would be much worse if we didn't have that. But for me, it has always been a plaster that's sort of dealing with the symptoms of the problem rather than trying to solve the root cause of the problem.